Hi everyone. So today what we're going to do is I'm just going to do a very old-fashioned style tutorial based on Vonnegut's 8 rules of writing. And I'm just going to share my screen because I've made a very, very funky and fun presentation. Let's see if that works. There we go. Beautiful. So the reason I've picked Vonnegut for today's little session is because his 8 rules of writing are genuinely the most wonderful and straightforward set of rules you can follow when doing your novel. He was more of a novel writer, of course, but I think these rules apply to everything, whether you're doing poetry, whether you're doing nonfiction, or perhaps even a biography as well. These rules of writing can be applied and engaged with. And of course, you can always break rules. You don't have to abide by everything, but you can certainly ensure that everything you're writing aligns with key principles that other great writers that have come before us have engaged with. So these are the 8 rules of writing by Vonnegut. His probably most famous work is Slaughterhouse-Five. So I'll go to this one. Slaughterhouse-Five. He writes with such brilliant charm that you forget he shifts genres. So when you're reading a book, usually you understand the fictive world of the text through the lens of a genre. For example, say if you pick up a realist book, okay, say you're picking up something like Camus' The Plague, okay, we're going to talk about that story later, but it has a very realistic description of the landscape, of the setting, of the characters, and say by page 150, suddenly an alien comes down out of space, and you're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. It's not plausible. But then, of course, what happens is if you pick up, say, War of the Worlds by Wells, if you're thrown immediately into a science fiction space, you're in an intergalactic, spaceship port. It's not that surprising if an alien comes in. You're like, yeah, okay, cool, that's plausible. Genre creates the world in which you expect certain things to happen or not happen. The brilliant thing about Vonnegut is he's able to fuse genres in a way that perhaps other writers haven't been able to do so successfully. In Slaughterhouse-Five, you have a very realistic description of someone working in an optometry practice, but then he gets abducted by aliens, and you go along with it. You buy it because of the way he structures and the way he writes his text. So that's one of the reasons that we're going to study him today, and why we should really take his advice on his 8 rules. Now, his 8 rules are pretty straightforward. So you've got discard suspense. So that's a bit counterintuitive, right? Usually we think of suspense as something that is integral to the plot, structural, to engaging with the reader. Nobody's going to read my story if I don't have some sort of suspense. Vonnegut's actually saying do the opposite. He then says give the character something to the audience, something to love about the character, right? Root for the character, adore the character. You want the character to win. That is incredibly important because it immediately creates a sense of pathos meaning empathy towards the figures in the text. Don't be a time waster. Okay, that one is pretty straightforward. I'm sure we've all heard that from multiple people in our lives in multiple contexts. We need to try and make sure no one's time is wasted. We need to make sure every character wants something. And I'm going to give a few examples of all of these things in a second, but that's something really important as well. Make sure every character wants something. Even if you think a character, say in an existential text like The Stranger, right? You might think Masseau doesn't want anything. He does. Every character actually wants something, just as everybody in our everyday lives have an objective. Start as close to the end as you can. So this one's super important because we tend to waffle, and I think that kind of goes in with don't be a time waster. The idea with making sure you don't, again, bore your reader by starting close to the end, you're engaging them with key aspects or key issues. Every sentence either advances action or demonstrates character. So again, kind of going back to don't be a time waster. Make sure everything that you write is integral to an overarching conception of either plot-driven action or characterization. Write to please only one person, which is kind of the opposite to what we tend to think of. We need to write to please lots of people or to a broad audience. He's saying just please one group of people or one person. And we'll talk about that afterwards. And then, of course, the last one, be a sadist. He's not arguing for you to actually be a sadist, but you want to almost torture your character a little bit to see how much they're able to tolerate in life, which is an interesting concept. So without further ado, let's do the first one. Now, for each of these rules, I've picked a different text. I'll quickly take you through the book so you have a bit of reference, a bit of context. And then we're going to have a look at how that great book demonstrates that rule. So for the first one, I've picked Chronicles of a Death Foretold, which is by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Any Spanish speakers can correct me if I'm incorrect. And this one is a perfect example of discarding suspense, because the first line of the story is literally telling you the murderous event that's going to be the complication and to an event, the climax of the entire book. So I put the sentence there. On the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nazar got up at 5:30 in the morning to wait for the boat. The bishop was coming on. Right? That's literally how the story starts. Our sense of suspense is completely destroyed. Now, that is very symbolic, that first sentence, of the overarching theme in the text regarding fate and free will. So this story is kind of, there's a couple of things that it's doing. It shows the incompetency of authority figures and in the justice system. It shows the normalization of violence in Colombian society in the aftermath of Valencia, which is the Colombian Civil War in 1948 to 1958, and all the subsequent guerrilla wars. So this story has a very rich contextual history, which we won't go into, but definitely if you haven't had a look into the book or you haven't had a look at the context in depth, go for it, because it's really interesting. But power imbalances and fixation on honor are subset themes, which are all demonstrating that overarching idea: can somebody change their fate? Or how much free will is there in a society which has such incompetent authority figures, which has almost such dictated pre-existing ideas of what is right and what is wrong. So Santiago is a general plot. Santiago Nazar is brutally killed outside his home the morning after the town's biggest wedding. The killers are Pedro and Pablo Vicario, twins and brothers of the bride, Angela. So that's the key event which happens, and it's said right at the beginning. We know what's going to happen because Marquez doesn't just foreshadow, he tells us what is going to happen. We get to focus then on that contrast between fate and free will. So by discarding suspense, he's actually been able to highlight his thematic concern with greater ease. And I think that's something that would have made Vonnegut very proud. But it's also what makes this text so iconic, right? Not many stories, but particularly like murder, not mystery, but murder, crime style sort of genre stories, they never do that. They usually keep you waiting. So the important thing with any text that we have a look at is that we want to have a look at the arc, right? Like we've got the introduction, we've got orientation of characters and setting, usually very traditionally within Freytag's triangle. You've got complication, then rising action, climax, and then denouement or resolution. That's a very stereotypical kind of story arc, right? This one, by discarding suspense, has also destroyed the very classical and very normal structure of Freytag's triangle, of that story arc. It's put the complication at the beginning, and because of that, it's made it a very iconic but also very creative way of describing a novel and describing the events in the novel. So definitely consider this when you're writing. It will certainly make your story stand out and definitely worthy of consideration. So the next story, or the next text that we're going to do, is The Plague, which I foreshadowed before. And this is a really good example of the rule, give the reader a character to root for. So The Plague, which is, I think, actually my favorite thing written by Camus, even though I love a lot of what he did. He's a brilliant, brilliant writer. But The Plague is set in Iran, Algeria, and the crisis begins in the city when thousands of rats emerge and die in the street. So already, I mean, it's called The Plague. We have rats. We go, okay, we know what's going to be happening. When public alarm grows, the authorities eventually start collecting and cremating all the dead rats. And then Dr. Rieu, who's the main figure in this text, the character that we're going to root for, identifies the illness as the bubonic plague. Rieu then struggles against official denial and inaction, the city kind of just trying to ignore it until the fact that obviously they can't, and then they go into strict quarantine. So throughout that life under quarantine, you have explorations of grief, of absence, of people attempting to avoid quarantine and run away. Rieu is the stereotypical kind of compassionate, intellectual doctor that is attempting to do good by society, attempting to do good by everybody. And you immediately want this character to not just survive the plague, but also succeed in everything that he does. You have an incredible amount of pathos for this figure who is battling against the hardship of this incurable, well, in the context, very incurable and horrible disease. So I put a sentence here that really demonstrates the way Camus is creating a setting and creating a character, or character's relationship with the setting, which makes us root for Rieu. It makes us really root for everything that the character attempts to do. So in this respect, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists. They disbelieved in pestilences. A pestilence isn't a thing made to man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away. But it doesn't always pass away. And from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away. And the humanists first of all, because they have taken no precautions. Camus is just probably one of the best writers of the 20th century. I don't think anybody can argue me on that point. But in that description, see how we are actually put in the setting. Our townsfolk were like everybody else. So the audience, the reader's going, oh, hang on, I'm like everybody else in this town. And Rieu is doing his best to try and save us, to save the people, not just in the story, but outside as well. He's trying to warn us. He's trying to protect us. And so because we have this connection with the character, a character who's trying to heroically bolster against this horrible disease, we root for them. And I think just as a little sub point on The Plague, it was written in the context of World War II. So obviously the plague could symbolize something else as well, you know, the oncoming of war. But whether you take it literally or symbolically, we have incredible desire for Rieu to win. And I won't give the plot spoiler away at the end, but the plot event at the end then is far more emotional and far more engaging because we loved Rieu. So that's a good example of give the reader a character to root for. Don't waste time. Now, there's a lot of texts when I was trying to find a book that didn't waste time. There are actually a lot that don't, but there are actually quite a few classics that do. So, and when I say don't waste time, we're going to be looking at, you know, writers that aligned with Vonnegut's conception of don't waste time. So Vonnegut didn't like long explanations of setting and character that might have been beautiful and romantic and engaging, but didn't, again, progress the plot or engage the reader with something that was really, really important. So, for example, for that reason, Byron was most likely out, right? All the writers where they have beautiful writing that they write for writing's sake itself. And by the way, I actually don't mind that myself because I love that genre where they're just describing for 100 pages the landscape. If it's written beautifully, I love it. But Vonnegut would consider that a bit of a time waster. So for that reason, I picked Dr. Zhivago, which is a brilliant example of the way a writer can get not just straight into into the action, but also introduce the characters, the setting, the imperatives of those characters really early on. This is the first, I deliberately picked a section from chapter 1, part 1, right at the beginning of the story, and to contextualize. So Yuri Zhivago, who's our main character here, loses his mother young and is raised by Uncle Kolya. Apologies again for my Australian pronunciation of Russian words. Please forgive me. He studies medicine in Moscow, where he meets and marries Tonya, and they have a son, Sasha. As a military doctor, so again, we've got another doctor, Yuri glimpses Lara twice before meeting her properly, once at her mother's home and once after she shoots and wounds a man named Koromovsky at a party. Lara is married to Pasha, a soldier missing in action, and she has left her daughter Katya in Yuriatin while searching for him. Drawn to Lara but committed to his family, Yuri returns to Tonya and Sasha in Moscow. So you have his kind of like early life and first marriage. Then you have war, his affair and separation. So facing hardships in Moscow, the family relocates east to Tonya's family estate. And then Yuri reconnects with Lara again, and there ensues the affair. He remains with the partisans through the Russian Civil War before finally being released because I should have mentioned, he's captured by the partisan army. So a lot of different themes, and there's actually a lot in this story I won't go through because there's a whole thematic concern of reunion and loss and the final years of his life and all those sorts of things. However, if we have a look at the first section, despite the amount of plot that I just explained, he still doesn't waste time. And that's an important thing, because if you pick up Dr. Zhivago, it's probably about that big, which if for the amount of plot there is, it should really, if any of us were probably writing it, would probably end up looking like this. So let's read the first section and have a look at the way he gets straight into intertwining character with landscape, with plot. On they went, singing Rest Eternal, and whenever they stopped, their feet, the horses, and the gusts of wind seemed to carry on their singing. Passers-by made way for the procession, counted the wreaths and crossed themselves. Some joined in out of curiosity and asked, "Who is being buried?" Zhivago. They were told, "Oh, I see. That's what it is. It isn't him. It's his wife." Well, it comes to the same thing. May her soul rest in peace. It's a fine funeral. The last moments slipped by one, irretrievable. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the earth and everything that dwells therein. The priest, with the gesture of a cross, scattered earth over the body of Maria. I can't pronounce that last name. They sang. The souls of the righteous. Then a fearful bustle began. The coffin was closed, nailed, and lowered to the ground. Clods of earth rained on the lid as the grave was hurriedly filled by 4 spades. You get the idea. Incredibly engaging. He's not wasting any time. He's gone straight to a funeral, but also the way he's written it. He's got truncated sentences. Yes, he's got longer sentences, which create great detail. But when it's important, he gets straight to the point. And so if you want to learn how not to waste time with incredibly long plots, if you're one of those writers who has incredibly long plots, okay, and they're really complex and intertwined, have a read of Dr. Zhivago, because it has an incredibly complex intertwined plot, but he gets it done in about that much time. So keep that one in mind for your next writing. Now, characters want. Yes, we're doing Lord of the Rings because it is such an easy reference to understanding. Characters want. Explain the objective. The audience needs to know exactly what those characters desire, what their objective is. They need to understand what they're rooting for. It goes back to that idea of having a character to root for. Okay, well, if I'm rooting for this character, what do they want? What do they actually want to be doing? So, as I said here, it's a perfect example of how multiple characters can want the same thing and then propel the entire action of the storyline by focusing their collective energy on that want. Okay, so Fellowship of the Ring do not want for the ring to merely be destroyed. They want Sauron to be conquered, evil to be annihilated, and peace to return to Middle-earth. So yes, okay, maybe that's symbolized in trying to get the ring into the fiery pits of Mordor, but it's representing that collective desire for peace, which when we have a look at Lord of the Rings, it's very much allegorical within context of the Great War, so World War One. Now, Tolkien obviously didn't explicitly or go into detail about how Lord of the Rings can be symbolic of World War One, but it is well documented. So we've got like lots of biographers, and C.S. Lewis even himself. So John Garth, Janet Brennan, Kraft, they talk a lot about how wartime influences parallel The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion as well, and lots of Tolkien's poetry. C.S. Lewis also said that the characters' descriptions are very much evocative of the Great War, and of course C.S. Lewis was very good friends with Tolkien and also served in the war himself. So when we have a look at that contextual setting, we can see the way that the characters want to destroy the ring is very much a soldier's desire to destroy war, right? To destroy conflict itself by putting the ring in the fire and then destroying the battle between good and evil, essentially. Good wins out in the end. And I think that shared desire for peace in the aftermath of war, I mean, everybody can want that now as well, but it's something we connect to. As a reader, you're going, oh, yes, I want Frodo to win because I also share that want. So making sure that your character has a want that's also relatable, maybe not to everybody, but to at least one person, that can really help propel your story, because you're going, hang on a second, it's not just me that wants peace after war. Everybody is going to want that. So it's a great little plot device or a great writing device when we really start to think, does my character want something? Does he or she or they have an objective, which really helps guide the audience into a state of empathy. So that is your character's want. Next point is start at the end. Now we're going to use Slaughterhouse 5 because I don't think there's a better example of starting at the end than a non-linear text like Slaughterhouse 5. So this is probably one of my favorite books of all time. It's 1969 semi-autobiographic anti-war novel. And you've got your main character who's called Billy Pilgrim, a weak American soldier who becomes, there's a famous line, which is unstuck in time. So because of that, the character will jump around from ordinary life in optometry and then a prisoner of war and then the firebombing of Dresden, and then he's captured by aliens. But when you're reading it, everything's happening at once. And the reason for that is that when Billy's ascended into the alien realm by the Tralfamadors, it's the alien species, he's kidnapped by them, he starts to see time in a very different way. So and I've got the quotes here, all moments, past, present, and future, always have existed, always will exist. There is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no cause, no effects. What we love in our books are the depths of many marvelous moments seen all at one time. So brilliant description. It's very Heideggerian description of temporality. So the idea is that there's no future, present, past. We're able to conceptualize, and he goes further than Dasein. He's not saying that you can, it's not your psyche that's creating that experience or your mind or your spirit. It's actually the basic fabric of the universe that everything is happening at once. It's not a sequence of events. Because of that, Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse 5 definitely is the epitome of starting at the end, because there is no end and there is no beginning, really. It's just every big conglomeration of experience happening at once. So we've got the war in Dresden, which is Billy captured by Germans during World War II. This actually did happen to Vonnegut himself. So it's semi-autobiographical in that section. He and other prisoners are kept inside a former slaughterhouse in Dresden. Allied forces firebomb the city. That's a very famous historical event, killing tens of thousands. And then Billy and the others survive by hiding in the underground meat locker. So that's that moment. Then you've got the after the war, where he returns home, gets married, has a very stereotypical life, and then later in life he starts public speaking about every event that happened to him. He works as an optometrist for a while, and his mind randomly jumps through past, present, and future because of what he endures in the war. He relives his childhood, his post-war job as an eye doctor, and, I forgot as well, he also has a plane crash too. So lots of traumatic events, which lead up to when he was kidnapped by the aliens. And these aliens see every point of time at once, and they think death is just a bad moment in one specific time, but the person is fine in all other times. So this gives Billy a fatalistic view of life. And it's also a very interesting response to, obviously, post-war trauma or post-war experiences after having to endure so much death and witnessing so many horrible things happen. So the Traumalfadorians provide almost an antidote to a lot of the grief that comes from enduring mortality or watching a lot of mortality take hold. The other thing that we'll read here is this last section on the slide, which is, why me? That is a very earthling question to ask, Mr. Pilgrim. Why you? Why us, for that matter? Why anything? Because this moment simply is. Have you ever seen bugs trapped in amber? Yes. Well, here we are, Mr. Pilgrim, trapped in the amber of this moment. There is no why. And so this is almost a bit existential in the sense that he's equated all of us to this animal unable to leave this very sticky conception of time that we're trapped in. So when we are studying, starting at the end, doing a science fiction novel or a non-linear novel is incredibly good. But Vonnegut, I think, is the best because this is not classic science fiction. Like I mentioned before, this has almost every genre under the sun, which kind of proves the Traumalfadorians' point that everything is happening all at once. So definitely check out this book if you haven't. And as I said, I love this one, so I've reread it multiple times. So wouldn't go past recommending a reread. Okay. The next one is Advance or Die. So this text, obviously Macbeth, I've picked Macbeth because it's a very obvious one, but the idea is that you either, when you're writing a story, need to be describing the character. Oh, that's a nice typo, isn't it? Character. You either need to describe the character's intent or the progression of plot. So you're doing one or the other. Now, Shakespeare, a lot of people think that Shakespeare waffles a lot. I actually would argue that he doesn't, because everything he's doing in Macbeth is either progressing this plot of the witch's manipulation, if you adhere to that reading, manipulation, or Lady Macbeth's manipulation, or Macbeth's desire for power. Alternatively, they're doing descriptions. He's doing descriptions of the murderers killing Lady Macduff or the sons, etc. So he's either doing one or the other. Is he doing that with beautiful language that looks a bit fluffy? Yes, but he is absolutely doing one of those two things. And if you look at the most famous Shakespeare plays that everybody tends to read, let's have a think of them now. It's either Macbeth, which does character intent or progressing the plot perfectly. Hamlet. Now, Hamlet, okay, there's a lot of not progression of the plot, but there's an incredible amount of character. Okay, that's one of the things we all love about Hamlet is the characterization. So Romeo and Juliet, lots of plot progress. Okay, a lot happens actually in that play for the short amount of time that the characters know each other. What else is one of the more famous ones? They're the first three that come to mind. We've the other one that's usually studied a lot at schools is pardon me, King Lear, which is another brilliant one. But again, character and content, progression of plot is everywhere. Let's look at the less popular Shakespeares, which are still brilliant, but they're less studied. Say Merry Wives of Windsor. or Timon of Athens. Those two texts, as much as I love them, they probably do less plot progression and a bit more maybe comedic relief, right? Merry Wives of Windsor, you've got a lot of comedic relief. It's almost like a comedy show half the time. It doesn't always have plot or character. It's just kind of joking around. Timon of Athens, okay, that has quite a lot of plot progress and quite a lot of character intent, but it does have quite a few parties where it is characterizing Timon, but also probably some scenes which are not 100% necessary. So if we even have a look at Shakespeare's corpus, despite the genius of all of it, there are some texts that stand out more than others and have become more studied for certain reasons. And I would probably argue that this is one of the reasons, is that those texts do these two things perfectly and brilliantly above perhaps some of his other work. So I've got two sections here just for us to have a look at how much the language is either describing character or plot. So the first section is the famous soliloquy by Macbeth after Lady Macbeth has died, and it really describes his shift in character intent. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. If that doesn't describe Macbeth's internal world, I don't know what does. So brilliant work there. Then the progression of plot, I've picked a section from Lady Macbeth in Act 1, where she is starting to describe her motivation or her witch-like supernatural desire to control Macbeth such that she and he may assume power. So that's a very, very famous section, and it's a good example of progressing plot. So advance or die, just remember, even Shakespeare has his hits and his flops, and his hits definitely do this rule. So keep that in mind when you're writing. So please only one person. Now, you might think, why did I pick Voltaire? Well, Voltaire definitely pleased himself when he was writing. If there was ever a writer that I can imagine sitting on his throne, laughing at his own work, happily laughing at his own satire, I can see Voltaire doing that. God bless him. So Candide is, again, probably what I'm really being quite biased in this, because Candide's one of my favorite books as well. And Candide is 1759 novella, is what we're looking at here. And it's about a naive young man who is thrown out of his sheltered home after kissing the Baron's daughter. Iconic Voltaire moment. He travels the world suffering through wars, shipwrecks, earthquakes, natural disasters. And the whole point of that is that horror, right? That terrible sequence of events is that he starts to reject his tutor's optimistic ideals around living. So the optimism that was very, very disliked by a lot of the Enlightenment period because they were far more realistic. That optimism, which Voltaire disliked, is going against Leibniz. Now, Leibniz, not that, we can say exactly how much Voltaire liked or disliked somebody, but he essentially is trying to please himself or his Enlightenment reader who disagrees with any overarching conceptions of life as an idealized romantic perception of existence, right? So also when you're reading it, Pangloss, who is the tutor, he becomes almost insufferable. Like when an earthquake occurs and he's going, oh no, but then all these other great things happen. You're like, actually stop talking, Pangloss, like please. So when we're going through this, I'll just quickly give you a little tiny plot summary. So when he travels, my favorite bit actually after when he's banished from paradise in the German castle, Pangloss tries to argue that everything happens for the best reason possible, okay, which is a big, Leibniz thing to argue that everything is happening for the best reason possible. And we hear that today as well. There's kind of, and again, absolutely no disrespect to them, but the people who always go, oh, well, this really bad thing happened, but everything happens for a reason, right? That sort of a sentiment. That would make Pangloss or an optimist incredibly happy. However, Voltaire is very much disagreeing with that statement, and I would also disagree with that as well. In his experience of war, he's tricked into the Bulgar army, and Candide witnesses the horrific slaughters of the time period. So we get beatings, we get whippings, we get horrible things. When he reunites after that disaster, when he reunites with Pangloss in Holland, they travel to Portugal, where a massive earthquake destroys Lisbon, and Pangloss is hanged by the Inquisition and Candide is whipped. At this point, obviously, Candide is very much starting to question whether or not everything happens for the best reason possible. So if we read these sections here, which I've collected from the text, I have wanted to kill myself 100 times, but somehow I am still in love with life. This ridiculous weakness is perhaps one of our more stupid melancholy propensities, for is there anything more stupid than to be eager to go on carrying a burden which one would gladly throw away, to loathe one's very being and yet to hold it fast, to fondle the snake that devours us until it has eaten our hearts away? Optimism, said Cacambo. What is it that? Alas, replied Candide, it is the obstinacy of maintaining that everything is best when it is worst. You're a bitter man, said Candide. That's because I have lived, said Martin. So these little extracts, you can see how he's creating a polemic against anybody who is of the time period and believes that, well, an anti-Enlightenment sentiment, essentially, anybody that's anti-Enlightenment. So when he is writing Candide, he's pleasing one person, which is the Enlightenment person, the person that's aligning with that belief system, and then the anti-Enlightenment he's very much disagreeing with. So that's Candide. Obviously, when you're pleasing only one person, that probably comes more into, your maybe your didacticism. Maybe you have a moral in your story that some people are not going to like, or maybe you have a perception or a perspective on a certain idea that a lot of people in society are not going to agree with, and that's okay as long as you're pleasing one person. That's what Vonnegut is saying we can do without problem. So the next one, which is be a sadist, but not really. There's no other text. The first text I thought of that would demonstrate being a sadist is 1984, because poor Winston is betrayed. He's tortured in room 101. He's imprisoned. He has a secret police, the thought police, right? So many police, so many examples of constriction, dictatorial authority completely restraining the individual, their psyche and their ability to think, their freedom of expression. Plethora of examples. However, when your person, when your character, when your protagonist, your hero is attempting to overcome all of these events, whether it's in 1984 through his diary or his affair with the woman, the key female figure, we have immediate empathy for Winston and his horrible stomach ulcer. Okay, we have immediate desire, and again, linking back to the character, the audience having empathy with that character. That's a really key point, is that if you're treating the character with what possibly could go wrong, you're actually not only engaging the plot with really interesting points, you're going to have much more interesting topics of discussion. You're also engaging the reader in a way that perhaps would never happen, right? When you're reading Candide and you're in an earthquake, or you're reading 1984 and he's being horribly tortured in room 101, you feel for them. You're completely possessed by the desire for this character to overcome the hardship that they're enduring. Unless you're actually a sadist, in which case you're not. But most of us, thankfully, on planet Earth are not. So being a sadist, there are lots of texts that do that. But when you think about it, the formulation of any story usually is predicated on the fact that something's going to go wrong. You have the orientation, and then something terrible happens. And because of that, a sequence of events occurs that need to be resolved at the end. That's the most classic kind of storyline. It's based on the assumption that something bad is going to happen. So when you're writing a story, it's about really how bad do you want that thing to happen? Do you want it to be a bit absurdist and, Goddo's just not turning up? Or do you want to do something really terrible, right? Like a Stephen King novel. There's obviously degrees, but Vonnegut's saying, do the worst. So let's see what can happen. What could possibly happen if the worst set of circumstances occurred? Let's play with that. So this 1984 text, I think you probably take any dystopic story and come to the conclusion that being a bit tough or cruel to your characters is an interesting plot device. It's an interesting way of writing. However, again, as I said, I don't think it would be hard to come by a story or even a poem where you are having a text that does not have any description or explanation of a complication. I think when you're writing, definitely keep in mind these 8 plot devices, because you might want to break them, which is awesome, right? If you're going, no, I'm going to have nothing wrong happen to the character, I'm going to be the most compassionate, saint-like writer, okay, when I'm talking about this character or their experiences. Awesome. Break the rules. That's perfect, right? But in saying that, Vonnegut has a point, and he's probably got a very good reason for making those rules, and he actually abides by them. So when you read like a writer's guidebook, or like, oh, these are the best stories or texts and this is the best set of rules to follow, but then you read their work and they don't really do that. Stephen King mainly, he'll give writing advice and it like does not match what he's done. Vonnegut actually does everything that he's saying, whether it's Hocus Pocus, which is another great story of his, or like we were talking, Slaughterhouse 5, everything he writes is incredibly in alignment with those 8 rules, and he's brilliant. So worth considering. Along with, we saw how The Plague and Shakespeare and all these great writers, Dr. Zhivago, all these great texts actually do align with a lot of the rules that are given out there. So next time you're writing, have a go. Consider one of those 8, or maybe all of them when you're writing. See what you can do. Play around with them. You are a writer after all. And if you're just reading, even if you're just passively reading, awesome. Have a think about how one of those 8 rules might be implicating a character or engaging you with the story in a very different way. So thank you so much for joining, everybody. That's very kind of you all to come along, and let me know what you think about these 8 rules, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again next time. Thank you.